Wonderful. Okay.
There it
So
is.
last
Yes. Okay, cool.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for your patience. So today we are going to continue on a very specific aspect of the future of medicine, and that is one of my areas of expertise, that is space medicine. We're going to talk about what we know about space medicine to date and the challenges that we face going forwards. As always, if you have questions, just place them in the chat. If they can wait till the end, we'll do them at the end. And if you think they're timely, feel free to interrupt. All right, so we heard about my background last time. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in detail later this section, later this session, about some of the work I've done in austere environments. So we won't get into it too much this time. I do have several space affiliations and I guess disclosures. That being said, I'm not being paid to do this talk. And in fact, we'll probably get into some of these positions and their relevance to the spaceflight environment as we get going. So why are we having this session on space medicine today? By the end of today, I hope that you have a sense of the hazards of the spaceflight environment, how we mitigate these risks, what constraints we face when packing for space, how we prepare for space before ever going there and why it's important, how we can use emerging and accelerating technologies when it comes to planning for space, and then how we can bring those challenges back to Earth and what our next generation challenges may be. Okay, so let's start with a bit of a thought experiment. Imagine that you as the crew physician are going to the moon today. What are you going to pack with you? Well, in order to know what you're packing for, you need to know what your priorities for survival are. So we've all seen this before in our introductory psychology courses, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting with survival, food, shelter, sleep, escalating to safety, and ultimately proceeding to self-actualization. This, however, being 2022, I think we need to add a very fundamental layer of the pyramid, that being Wi-Fi. I don't know about you, but I think a lot of us wouldn't do as well as we did without the connectivity we have during the pandemic. But speaking more practically and seriously, let's talk about why we need to pack specifically for space and what the challenges of the spaceflight environment bring with them. So this includes a whole laundry list of threats, including everything from increased radiation. So we're going to talk about this in detail a little bit later this hour. The increased acceleration, deceleration loads of launch, altered day-night cycles. So if you're on Earth, your day-night cycle is 24 hours. I'll just get everyone to just be on mute just because I'm hearing some background noise, unless you have a question. Altered day-night cycles. So when you're on the International Space Station orbiting 400 kilometers above the Earth's surface, you're actually orbiting the Earth at a rate of 1 sunset, 1 sunrise cycle every 90 minutes. So that is 16 sunrise sunset cycles every 24 hours. You have to live and work in an extremely operationally demanding schedule in a very confined pace. So aboard the ISS, astronauts often have their days scheduled down to the 5-minute mark. And they also have to play nice with each other despite this highly stressful closed space. No one wants to be that guy or gal who's ultimately voted off the space station. You also have to trust in the engineering behind your spacecraft. So this is its own life support vessel. So we have to trust the spacecraft to protect us from the extremes of the spaceflight environment. We have to trust that the shielding of the space station is adequate enough to filter out some radiation and filter out the threat of orbital debris, that it'll keep us safe from the vacuum of space. And then we also have to trust the life support system within that life support system. So that is what we call our environmental closed loop life support system. So this maintains the temperature, humidity, and cleanliness of our atmosphere. So it's continuously scrubbing out volatile gases, excess CO2. We also have to deal with the fact that we're remote and resource limited. So if we need a hospital, it's not just an ambulance right away. And then of course the everyday lumps and bumps that we might encounter on Earth. So, fractures, infections, abrasions, electrocution. And then of course there's the weightless elephant in the room, the thing that we all think about when we think about the space flight environment, and that is weightlessness, more formally known as microgravity. So when we're in the orbiting our spaceship, we're falling at the same rate in parallel to the Earth. So we perceive that as weightlessness. And so with that actually come a whole host of physiological adaptations and even problems. So suffice to say, every single bodily system is affected by the space flight environment. So that means our bones, every one of us here in this lecture today has the luxury of being loaded by gravity. So our bones being offloaded by gravity, especially our weight-bearing and axial bones like our pelvis and our spines, are no longer have to resist gravity. So they actually lose bone density, and this doesn't plateau off. This occurs at a rate of 1.5% every month, and without mitigation and countermeasures, can actually reflect a state like osteoporosis that we would see here in certain populations on Earth. So that needs to be mitigated. Otherwise, the astronauts open themselves up to increased osteoporosis risk. On the muscle side, we see, again, due to the offloading by gravity, muscle mass decreases, muscles atrophy. We see that fluids shift upwards. So basically here, again, in 1G, we have the luxury of having that 1G gravity gradient, and then blood is returned upwards through back to the heart through our veins. Without the luxury of gravity, all of this blood shifts upwards, and actually our heart and our baroreceptors interpret this as an increasing fluid circulating load. And astronauts for the first few days on station actually urinate more of fluid mass out because of this, and actually become a little bit dehydrated. The other part of this consequence of this fluid shift is fluid shift upwards, causing congestion. So we've actually very aptly called this moon phase. So here you can see Jack's astronaut, Dr. Chakti Mukai. She was also a cardiovascular surgeon. You can see her in the 1G state here on the left, and then you can see that round puffy moon phase up on the space station in 0G, because all of those fluids are pooling upwards. And what that means is astronauts will always feel congested, feel like they have a cold, and the practical consequence of that is they may have congestion headaches, and that food doesn't taste as good because it's more bland, so it needs to be more spicy, more flavorful, more textured in order for them to find it palatable. And if you're paying attention, when I say every single bodily fluid in the human body is affected, we really mean that. So in the last 15 years or so, we've also discovered something called the Space Adaptation Neuro-Ocular Syndrome, or SANS. And basically this means that the cerebrospinal fluid, that brain juice that bathes our spines and brains, also tends to shift upward, and we note impaired drainage through the CSF, lymphatics, and veins from the central nervous system, resulting in disproportionate pressure distributions, including increased pressure around the backs of our eyeballs, where our optic nerve exits from our retina into our back to our brain, causing actually edema around the optic nerves, and in some cases causing vision shifts, vision changes, hyperopia in certain astronaut populations. This actually is found to occur in longer duration space flights, so space flights over 30 days. It's not that you simply go up into 1G and experience this. And we also find ocular changes, so flattening of the eyeball, flattening of the choroidal folds at the back of the eyeball. And the interesting thing about this is this predominantly affects male astronauts, and we just don't know why. The most analogous condition that we can find to this for the medical students out there in the audience is idiopathic increased hypertension in the brain on Earth, but that also is a bit different because that also causes headaches, where this SANS syndrome doesn't. It disproportionately affects females, so there are some differences. So coming back to gender differences, when we talk about physiological effects in the microgravity environment, we know that there are some gender effects. So for example, female astronauts are more prone to orthostatic hypotension once they return to Earth post-flight, and this is thought to be due to valvular decompensation. The veins in our legs get, the valves in those veins get lazy, and resulting in increased cooling. in the legs, making the astronauts more prone to fainting when they come back to Earth. So when you see these astronauts return to Earth in a Soyuz space capsule and they're being carried out with a hero's welcome, part of it's pomp and circumstance, but part of it is practical because we just don't want the astronauts to faint on TV. Female astronauts having a shorter urethra compared to male astronauts are more prone to UTIs, whereas male astronauts, like we talked about, are more prone to that space adaptation neuroocular syndrome. They're also seeming to be prone towards hearing loss with advancing age, and again, we don't know why. And this is what we know from decades of human spaceflight, but we're still finding things out all the time. So this is the famous NASA twin study published in about 2016, 2017. So there's two identical astronaut twins, Scott Kelly and Mark Kelly. They're both retired Navy captains. They both are NASA astronauts. Scott Kelly actually spent a year in space while Mark Kelly spent a year on the ground. And having the luxury of having two identical genomes, this is actually the most comprehensive study to date. It was through by assembling a massive team of collaboration between biochemists, molecular geneticists. The team studied everything from the proteome to metabolomics to DNA methylation, cognition at the macro level. And so there were lots of findings. Some of them were surprising, some of them were transient. An interesting part about the study is that Scott Kelly actually administered the first ever vaccine in space. He administered a flu shot on himself and he mounted an appropriate immune response, which is interesting because we know that being in spaceflight environment makes us a little bit immunosuppressed. We found transient changes in the gut biome. We think that's more due to the nature of the diet that was changed while on station, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later this hour. And some changes were returned to normal, so that those changes in the gut biome that were found during spaceflight were back to normal 6 months post. And then some things were surprising. So telomeres shorten with age, the ends of our DNA. These were found to lengthen in Scott Kelly, but not in Mark Kelly. So we're still, the overall significance, it depends on what you're studying. There were some transient changes in cognition and performance. So the bottom line is what we know about space is still changing and all the data is still emerging and the surprises keep coming. So here's another study from 2019 during a routine handheld ultrasound study on the ISS. So astronauts had a handheld ultrasound, were studying the blood flow in their jugular veins, when lo and behold, all of a sudden they visualized a giant thrombus or clot in their jugular vein. And so now we had to ask ourselves, is space a hypercoagulable environment? Does it make us more prone to clotting? So despite having sent humans to space for the better part of 60 years, we're still finding things out. And all of this is to say, if you take nothing else from this part of this primer on spaceflight physiology and space medicine, it's simply that space is trying to kill you. And this is just the data that we know from decades of data in low Earth orbit. So this is decades of data from the International Space Station, Space Shuttle, Skylab, Mir. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what happens when we go beyond low Earth orbit? And this isn't a theoretical question. The international community, so NASA, JAXA, the Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, Roscosmos and more have plans to go beyond low Earth orbit, starting with the moon, starting with Lunar Gateway. So this is the first ever deep space station. So there are 20-year-olds alive today who have never known an existence without a continuously crewed off-world presence in the form of the International Space Station. There are going to be toddlers born later this decade for whom it will be normal to have a space station in deep space orbiting around the moon. So this is a little bit different than the International Space Station. It will be smaller. It will be non-continuously crewed. So crews will go for 30 to 60 days at a time. The mandate is for Earth observation, solar observation, astronomy, lunar observation, and then of course, very importantly, serving as a way station to get to the surface of the moon and also going to Mars. And speaking of altered day-night cycles, which we talked about with the International Space Station, the orbit of the Gateway is such that one day-night cycle is 7 days. So again, there's that altered circadian rhythm. This is just part of the international community's plan for deep space exploration. So the next part of this roadmap is Artemis. So for those of you who pay attention, this is the successor to the Apollo human moon mission. So this is the plan, NASA's plan to put the first woman, first person of color, and next man on the moon with a view towards, with a view towards observing and establishing permanent permanent lunar surface operations by the end of this decade, with a view towards exploratory and scientific activities. And then the other objective of Artemis is also to serve as a test bed for Mars, which is much, much further away. So to travel to the moon with current technologies, it takes about 3 to 5 days. To get to Mars, depending on the alignment of the two planets of the Earth and Mars, it takes about 6 to 9 months. And we'll talk about what that translates into autonomous needs in a few slides' time. And it's not just the space agencies. The commercial space sphere is also interested in going to Mars. So Elon Musk famously in 2016 at one of the world's largest space conferences announced his plan to send humans to Mars by the 2030s. And Boeing said, not to be outdone, said it would beat SpaceX to Mars, perhaps incurring a new space race. So how does what we need to worry about change when we talk about going further? So the first part of the consideration is dust. So lunar regolith, lunar dust, dust on Mars. We know from our experiences with the Apollo missions that lunar dust was a major skin irritant and respiratory irritant. It clogged up the suits and the joints of the extravehicular activity or EVA spacesuits. So for anyone who ever tells you that the moon landing was faked, they put a lot of effort into it because there's hundreds, if not thousands of pages of documentation dedicated to lessons learned from Apollo, as well as irritants and things to look out for, like lunar dust. We alluded to this briefly in the first slide on challenges in the spaceflight environment, but I want to spend more time on it now, and that's radiation. And the bottom line is the further out you go, the more radiation you have to contend with. So here on Earth, we're still relatively protected. We're quite protected, in fact, from energy that might come from space. And that's by being in the virtue, being low enough, being in the confines of the Van Allen belts, which filter out high energy ionizing radiation. And that's also true when you're on the International Space Station. So even at the ISS, you're still within the protective confines of those Van Allen belts, but you're still exposed to 250 times the amount of radiation that you would experience while at on ground level. For comparison, a commercial flight exposes you to 40 times the amount of radiation that you would be exposed to on Earth. And also the nature of radiation you're being exposed to changes. So remember, we talked about higher energy ionizing radiation. This is filtered out when you're in low Earth orbit and when you're on Earth. By the time you're going to deep space like the moon and beyond, you suddenly have to contend with the increased radiation and energy from solar particle flares, solar particle events, as well as background galactic cosmic radiation. So practically speaking, this translates into yearly limits as well as career limits for what different organs can be exposed to, as well as what gender, female and male astronauts can be exposed to. And that's because of increased sensitivity for female reproductive organs to radiation exposure. So for example, you can see here on this chart, when we look at the 30-day annual and career limits for different organs, when we talk about blood-forming organs, we see actually that on Mir, which was a Russian space station, the blood-forming organs actually exceeded the annual limit on the one-year Mir emissions. So these are relevant because as we propose to go into higher energy locales on longer duration missions, we also need to think about how are we going to engineer solutions to keep our astronauts safe. So moving on from radiation, we talked about these distances that we have to contend with. So for those of you who are Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans, you may have heard that Douglas Adams quote that space is big. Space is so vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big, you wouldn't believe it. So why is that relevant? Well, it's because light can only travel so fast, even going at the speed of light. So even at the level of the ISS, it's close enough to Earth, only 450 kilometers on average, that you don't notice a communication delay. By the time you're at the level of the moon, a round-trip communication comes with a 2.4-second delay. Now, so you can still hold a communication. You may notice some inconveniences, but absolutely you can hold a real-time communication. By the time you get to Mars, depending on the alignment of the two planets, you're suddenly contending with a 8 to 48 minute round trip delay, depending on the source you ask. Some say 6 to 46 minutes. So now imagine that you are the crew doctor and you have a massive medical emergency, someone's bleeding out, someone's in shock. You don't have time to refer to mission control back on Earth to ask for help. So when we're summarizing the challenges of space medicine when it comes to deep space missions, we can summarize them as what we call the big five. So we talk briefly about altered gravity environments, but so far we've been talking about weightlessness and microgravity. So we have the luxury of billions of years of evolution in 1G, knowing that this is safe for us. And we know from decades of human spaceflight that microgravity is not enough, but we don't know what level of gravity is enough. So that becomes important because we contend with 1/6 gravity on the moon and 38% gravity on Mars. So if you weigh 100 pounds on Earth, you weigh 17 pounds on the moon, 38 pounds on Mars. We talked about the communication delays that come with the increasing distance from Earth. We talked about radiation. Isolation and confinement is a very real consideration. And so we're going to talk about how we mitigate that, starting with crew selection. And then there's everything else that falls under what we call the guise of hostile environments. So this includes altered day-night cycles. This includes lunar regolith and dust. And so basically, all of this is to say we have a host of problems to contend with. So coming back to our initial question when we first started off this lecture, you're the crew doctor, you're asked to pack for the moon. What do you pack now? So we've established the problem space. Let's take a step back and breathe and look at what mitigation tools we have at our disposal to prepare for space. So everything in space and human spaceflight starts with risk mitigation and prevention. Prevention is our #1 tool for keeping astronauts safe in space. So this starts with selection. I often like to say that the path towards becoming a NASA or CSA astronaut is littered with the hopes and dreams of medically disqualified candidates. People have been disqualified in the past for everything from having a history of disc herniation to anemia to thyroid disorders to being colorblind. And the reason is these selections are geared towards finding the healthiest of the healthy, so we don't have to treat something in situ in space when it happens. This is as an extension of that, there's extensive psychological screening. NASA famously in the past has had its candidates complete 600 question psychological battery inventories. And then it continues on with risk mitigation. So for those of you who have an engineering background, you'll be familiar with this risk matrix. And basically, we look at the consequence of something happening and the likelihood of it occurring. So if something is high likelihood and mission deleterious, if it occurs, then you need to mitigate it before your mission can proceed. If something is low likelihood to occur, or it's of a low consequence, if it does occur, you probably don't dedicate resources towards mitigating it. Keeping astronauts healthy in space continues with monitoring. It continues with pre, in-flight, and post-flight rehab and mitigation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. It continues with nutrition. So we talked about some of the challenges of nutrition, of it needing to be more textured and flavorful, but it also needs to have a long shelf life, and it also needs to be high nutrient content, and it also needs to be relatively lightweight because of the cost of transporting materials to space. So let's talk a little bit more about what astronauts do on station to mitigate some of those challenges. And before I move on from this slide, I just wanted to mention some of the other on-station um, pre-flight mitigation measures. So pre-flight quarantine of several weeks to make sure they bring no infectious diseases to the station. So NASA was doing it before COVID made it cool. But the last thing you want is having a COVID outbreak on station, knowing that astronauts are immunosuppressed and that data in other germ species have shown that viruses, for example, can be more virulent in space. So far, clinically, it has not shown to be of a clinical consequence, i.e. astronauts are not getting more sick. And then we also have on-station resources. So there will be a crew medical officer with 40 hours of medical training, as well as an onboard medical kit with medication, supplies, and protocol. So what do we have on station? So we have the environmental closed loop life support system that maintains the health of our environment, that maintains the temperature, humidity, clean atmosphere. We have the countermeasures system. So remember, we talked about the risk of losing density, bone density and muscle mass. So to counteract that, astronauts actually have to perform aerobic and resistive exercise to be able to load their bones and muscles. And then, of course, there's in situ treatment. So what does the exercise regimen of an astronaut look like? Astronauts are actually subjected to 1.5 to 2 hours of aerobic activity, as well as resistive exercise for 6 days of the week. So how do they lift weight in space if there's no gravity? There's actually an advanced resistive exercise device that's based on hydraulics. So they can actually perform squats and other weight-bearing exercises with the use of those hydraulics. And there's a treadmill on station that you can see an image of here in the upper left corner. My favorite piece of trivia is that it's actually called the Colbert, after comedian Stephen Colbert, because when they were naming the newest module of the space station, Stephen Colbert got his fans to overwhelmingly vote to name the space station module after him. And as a tribute to him, NASA compromised and said, well, we'll just name it a treadmill after you. We also have in situ life support and medical support. So we have medical kits, we have basic life support, we have advanced crew medical restraint systems. So if you have to perform CPR in space, there's a way to do that in zero gravity. And then you also have immediate real-time communication with the flight surgeons on the ground. So caring for astronauts is a very multidisciplinary approach. There's 24/7 flight surgeon coverage from the ground between the 5 ISS partner states. So with the International Space Station, there'll be a flight surgeon on console from NASA, from Canada, from Europe, Japan, or Russia. Multiple disciplines are involved with the overall care of astronauts. So this includes rehab specialists, occupational health, nutritionists, psychologists, physicians, and more. We also have computer modeling tools at our disposal to predict how to pack for space. So this is a snapshot of the integrated medical model. This comes out of NASA's Johnson Space Center Exploration Medical Capability. So this is a computer modeling tool that takes all of the kit contents of what you might have aboard the International Space Station, and then lets you extrapolate what you might need for a slightly different mission. So then you input the duration of your mission and how the crew size changes, as well as what your acceptable limits of risk, such as loss of crew life, loss of mission, risk of evacuation are. So now you say, okay, I want to do a 6-person mission to an asteroid that will be 9 months long. Let's extrapolate that based on data from what's happened on the ISS and what kit contents we have on the ISS. And this allows you to generate your crew kit, your medical kit contents based on those parameters, based on what you've deemed acceptable for risks for that mission. So if you're looking at this, you might notice it's a bit static that, if you have 6 different medical events, you might be actually going through your medical supplies and you may not be able to mitigate and address all of those medical events. So that's a very astute observation. So here is a successor, a follow-up computer modeling tool to the IMM. This is called the Medical Extensible Dynamic Probability Risk Assessment Tool. We call it the MedPrep because it's a lot easier to say. And this is based on neural networking and Bayesian modeling that allows us to input for multiple medical events at different mission time points, as well as countermeasures, as well as repairs. And then that way you can actually generate several different outcomes based on what may or may not happen. So it's a lot more dynamic, hence the name. Okay, so we've talked about the spaceflight environment, but what's actually happened in space so far? Well, I'm glad you asked. So here's a snapshot of the Integrated Medical Model Top 100 Medical Conditions, again out of NASA. So this includes everything from the terrifying mass hemorrhage, cardiac arrest, to things that are more common and will occur in space, such as headaches, such as carbon dioxide headaches, because in that zero-G environment, we don't have normal convection currents. CO2 pockets as you sleep, it forms a bubble in front of your mouth and you can get a headache from that. To things that are not life-threatening but equally terrifying in zero-G, like diarrhea in space. And this stuff has happened. What we know from space flight data is that the good news is it's more of the everyday annoying things that tend to be predictably happen in space flight. It's not the things like cardiac arrest. It's not the things like mass hemorrhage that have happened. So it's things like skin irritation, skin infection. You'll see that the number one highlighted occurrence is spaceflight adaptation syndrome. So this ties back to an effect of having your 1G environment taken away from you, and suddenly there's a mismatch between what your eyes perceive, what your proprioceptors, which perceive where your body is in space, and what your inner ear, which controls balance, perceives. And because of that, astronauts can become quite sick for up to 24 to 72 hours for their first few days in space. And that's why critical events like spacewalks are not scheduled for the first week on station. Another fun bit of trivia is that one of the most infamously sick astronauts from this was astronaut Jake Garn. And so informally, we measure space adaptation syndrome or sickness on the Garn scale. Okay, so we've talked about what happens in space. So knowing all of these pieces of puzzle, what is the hazards of the spaceflight environment, the tools we have at our disposal, what actually happens in space, what we need to be prepared for, what's the other part of the puzzle? What are our constraints? How do we pack for space? So NASA calls this the backpacking principle. If you're an avid hiker or a camper, you know that everything you bring with you is limited to what you can carry with you on your back when you're hiking. So you can only bring so much with you. You're constrained by mass and volume. So I like to call this the Aladdin principle of packing for space, because it takes infinite cosmic power to get there. Itty bitty living space when you do. So when we talk about how to pack for space, things should be ideally low cost, low volume, low mass, low power. They should be easy to use. They should have a long shelf life and be radiation resistant. Then as a bonus, it should be low astronaut operational time consuming. So remember, astronauts are tremendously busy. They're scheduled down to the 5-minute mark. So if you're telling them that you need 3 hours of their time, you may as well be asking for the moon. So again, it needs to be efficiently used. All of this comes to keeping human space comes together in a very multidisciplinary way. It's as we talked about, it's a interdisciplinary collaboration between the clinical side, the physicians, the physiologists, the exercise rehab guys, human factors engineering, the closed loop life support systems, as well as human performance, selecting those who will be mission driven, who do well in this type of austere environment. So here's an example of how all of that, those packing principles and those engineering principles come into play. So we talked about how everything needs to be modular and tightly packed away. So this is courtesy of NASA. This is a snapshots of what the medical kit contents look like aboard the ISS. So now as we extrapolate and we talk about sending humans beyond the International Space Station, this is how our challenges grow as we talk about going to increasingly dangerous and distant locales. So in addition to the big five, we also have to worry about the finer points of those big five challenges. So we have to worry about de-skilling from medical procedures we may have learned before. We have to worry about the effects of radiation. We have to worry about the risks of dust exposure. We have to worry about how our astronauts may integrate or may not integrate effectively with their computer and technological solutions. So this, if you remember nothing else from this the part of the talk, it's simply that space is hard, space is expensive, and space is trying to kill us. Prior to the advent of SpaceX and the commercial launch and return capabilities, it cost $10,000 US per kilogram of to send something to space. That cost is coming down with the increasing return of commercial capabilities and reusable launch vehicles. But it is still expensive and high risk to go to space. So how do we mitigate that? How do we prepare for space before ever going to space? So here's another question for you. What does the International Space Station have in common with a rural village in Kenya, an underwater research laboratory like the Florida International University's Aquarius Reef Base, or an Antarctic or polar medical expedition? So all of these are examples of isolated, confined, remote, resource limited, austere environments. So we'll call them ICE environments for short, isolated and confined extreme environments. So what do we learn from them? And how do we replicate the spaceflight environment? So I'm going to take you now through some of my experiences working and testing in some of these environments. So let's start with altered gravity environments. So the first one of these is micro and partial gravity. So some of you may have heard the term vomit comet. How do we replicate zero G without going to space? We do that through parabolic flight. People call it, more commonly call it the vomit comet because obvious reasons. And basically you replicate zero G for periods of 20 to 30 seconds at a time by flying in a parabola. So you're accelerating upwards at 2G, and then when you hit the crest of your parabola, you're falling at the same rate as the airplane. And it's just like when you reach the crest of a roller coaster on an amusement park, or when you're going down an elevator and you feel your heart lift into your throat for a second because you're falling at the same rate as your vehicle. And so parabolic flight is no different. And we've actually flown out of the National Research Council in Ottawa to test commercial spacesuits made by Final Frontier Design over the better part of 6 years, except during COVID. So I can keep telling you what it's like, but I'd rather show you. So I'm just going to share a quick video here. Let me just make sure the screen is sharing sound. Perfect. Here we go.
Power all the tasks so that I can record it.
No rain in the background? Not rain in the background. Umbrella? So Adam, I will get the bidding word back.
So if you ever have the opportunity to test a spacesuit in zero G, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. So I often get asked how high we're flying. We're actually not flying that high at all. We fly about 17 to 19,000 feet. We fly usually, depending on what aircraft or what company you're flying with, you'll fly maybe 12 to 30 parabolas at a time in sets of 5. And so for comparison, the Falcon 20 flies 17 to 19,000 feet. A commercial transatlantic flight flies at about 39,000, 40,000 feet. So that's one way of replicating artificial gravity and replicating certain parts of the spaceflight environment. And it's really good for sustained periods of microgravity for technology demonstrations, but you actually don't have to leave the ground to replicate altered gravity. So this is some testing we did again with Final Frontier Design, the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences, and the Canadian Space Agency, as well as the University of Maryland. And what we did was we were in the CSA's Lunar High Bay, and the University of Maryland has created this gravity offset harness. So the harness that you can see I'm testing actually allows you to offload your weight by whatever percentage you want. So in this particular scenario, we've offloaded my weight by 99%. So we're actually simulating microgravity, and I'm fixing a simulated panel outside the International Space Station. We also successfully simulated lunar gravity, 17% of Earth, and Martian gravity, 38% of what you'd experience on Earth. There's pros and cons to it. So you have more than 20 seconds of microgravity, but whatever you have in the harness is all that's offloaded. The instruments and the panels that I'm using are still 1G loaded. When we initially talked about altered gravity environments, we talked about the increased vibration and acceleration, deceleration loads of launch and landing. So how do you replicate those? Through a centrifuge. So this is the NASTAR Centrifuge Center outside of Philadelphia. And we were test subjects in a study to see how basically non-astronauts would experience altered and hypergravity loads in flight profiles that replicated commercial suborbital vehicles, so like Virgin Galactic, or at the time X-Corelix, which is now a company that's defunct. But basically, we underwent these increased G profiles, and at our highest, we were experiencing a 6G front-to-back load. And so you actually have to learn how to breathe appropriately in those situations, because when your chest wall is 6 times its body weight, it's tempting to actually just say, maybe I'll come back when the G load goes away. But they monitor you for that. And so my plan was to not breathe through it because it was so hard, but because they're watching on monitors, they say, hey, you should wake up now. And what you do is you actually increase your air intake and distribution through pursed lip breathing, as if you're breathing in and out through a straw. So switching environments, austere environments, we also learned a lot about studying in water analogs. So above water and below water. So this is, again, some testing we've done with IIAS. And again, using the Final Frontier Design spacesuit. This is what we called an IVA, or Intervicular Activity Spacesuit, different from the white one you just saw. So this one is meant to act as a life support, portable life support system in case your life support system within your spacecraft fails. The white spacesuit you see here is a bit more tricked out because it's meant for going outside of your spacecraft, so it has more temperature control, more radiation resistance. So in this particular scenario, we were actually testing how the spacesuit interacts with the water and making sure that you're able to safely egress out of your spacecraft in emergency scenarios. We also learn a lot by living and working underwater. So I was part of the Aquanaut, Neptune Aquanaut mission in 2019. This was a 5-day underwater excursion in the Florida Keys at the Jules Undersea Lodge. Like everything in space and exploration, Neptune is an acronym, and it stands for Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration. And so we performed experiments in psychology, stress, biometric monitoring, as well as technology demonstrations. And so here's that teaser I showed you from last time. And in this particular scenario, we were testing the electronic virtual reality radiology reading room in this underwater scenario. So I actually managed to contact the head of radiology in Saskatoon, Canada, 4,600 kilometers away. And we were actually able to meet in this virtual space and review a simulated trauma patient and collaborate and consult in that space. Just down the road from the Jules Undersea Lodge. So Jules is at 20 feet underwater. And this is the Aquarius Reef Base, that image I showed you a few slides earlier. This is actually at 60 feet underwater. This is where NASA runs its NEMO missions, NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations. They send their astronauts there for 8 to 16 days at a time. And the whole idea is to live and work in isolation and confinement, and again, perform science and technology demonstrations and out of habitat excursions. And the reason this is important is the deeper you go, when you're breathing the air at the same ambient pressure, you're actually in saturation. Those nitrogen bubbles that circulate through your blood actually go into saturation. And if you come out of that increased pressure atmosphere at too quick a rate, those nitrogen bubbles come out at too quick a rate and then form bubbles that lodge in places that are bad, causing things like joint pain, or in worst case scenarios, pulmonary embolisms, seizure, stroke, or even death. So when you're at 60 feet at the Aquarius Reef Base, you need to actually safely decompress for 16 hours and 47 minutes before you're safe to come up to surface pressure. And my favorite fact about this, which really hammers home the importance of why we use environments like this to train for space, is that by comparison, the soonest you can get to Earth from the International Space Station from the time you hit evacuation is 3 hours, 3.5 hours. You can get to definitive medical care from Kazakhstan, from the space station to Kazakhstan. So 3.5 hours versus nearly 17 hours. It takes longer to get to definitive medical care from the Aquarius Reef Base than it does from space. Isolated and confined environments. So we learn a lot from Mars analogs as well. This is the Mars Desert Research Station. It looks like Tatooine, but this is the Utah Desert. We call it real life on fake Mars. We go there for 2 weeks at a time. We bring our crew, our operations, our science with us, and it really is a lesson in crew dynamics and being an ideal teammate. I've been there as a crew medical officer as well as a commander, and really you're living and working as if you're on Mars. So you're subject to these amazing sprawling vistas. It's beautiful, it's fun to climb, but you also have to suit up every time you go out of your space habitat, otherwise the environment will kill you. So yeah, you're having fun climbing, but you're doing it all suited up in this tricked out spacesuit. We also work in lunar analogs. So this is Cinder Lake, just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. We were doing some planetary geology work there. And this is really cool because this is where they trained the Apollo astronauts. And they did so for lunar geology before they ever went to the moon. And the way they did that is they actually detonated explosives in this area to create craters like you would find on the moon. So you go to this region and you see all these gray silt craters, and you really feel like you're in a lunar landscape. And so we were able to, during this course, what we did is we looked at the geology lessons learned from Apollo. We learned their struggle points that they had while trying to operate traditional geology tools in a spacesuit. And then our challenge was to adapt typical field geology tools to be used in a spacesuit. So this is a tool that I developed during this course it's based on Mohs hardness testing. And it's adapted so you can actually use it while you're in a spacesuit because it has a longer reach and it requires less dexterity. Okay, almost to the end of this section, we also learned a lot about working in operational environments. So here's an example of a high altitude research campaign that we ran out of High Level, Alberta in 2017. So we're flying in a high altitude research aircraft unpressurized at 19,000 feet. So that's why we have the oxygen masks on, and we're testing this new tomography instrument you see over my right shoulder to study something called noctilucent clouds, thought to be related to climate change. And it really is a lesson in working as a highly functioning tight-knit team, because you have the research pilot, you have myself with payload specialist, as well as, and so I'm operating that tomography instrument to make sure it's pointing the right way. And then you have the mission specialist to make sure that you're flying the right trajectory that you want to. Finally, you don't have to go too far away from civilization to create a resource limited environment. This is a snapshot from the operational space medicine course that I run with IIAS. And basically we teach our participants to become space medical MacGyvers. So we take people with no medical background at all. So we had everyone from military pilots to software developers, and we took them through the principles of wilderness medicine, assessment, triage, and treatment. We took them through increasingly difficult scenarios, everything from simple traumas to mass casualties. And they all did phenomenally by the end of this. And so basically we teach them, using the resources you have at your disposal, how do you fashion a splint for this broken leg? How do you make a litter for this comatose patient? And there's actually research. There's a whole research community around both space medicine and even austere environments. So these are some colleagues of mine who have co-authored guidelines for the best practices for safety and healthcare in analogs like we just discussed. So speaking of maintaining the standard of healthcare, let's come back to space. So we've talked about preparing for space. We've talked about keeping astronauts healthy in space, but let's ask a what if question for a second. what if we didn't have to worry about any of these constraints? What would be the ideal treatment environment for our patients? And well, if we had no constraints, we would just terraform Mars, okay? We would give ourselves an atmosphere, a magnetosphere, we would give ourselves gravity. We wouldn't have to be worried about being isolated and austere. So let's build off that question. What if we didn't just provide the standard of care on Mars, but what if we seeked to surpass it? So, okay, how do we do that? Okay, well, this is the technology and future of the medicine class. So hopefully no one's surprised by the answer that we look at answers from technology. And in fact, we look at inspiration from science fiction. So let's ask these what if questions that we talked about developing last time. What if we said, okay, well, we don't want our astronauts to be exposed to increased radiation and decompensate and go mad from boredom on a 9-month journey to Mars? What if we could just teleport? What if we didn't want our astronauts to have brittle bones and, to faint from being exposed to gravity once they land on Mars? Well, what if we created an artificial gravity rotating space station, just like we see in Space Odyssey 2001? What if we could give decompensated astronauts exoskeletons so they're still able to work once they land on Mars, borrowing ideas from Star Wars and sci-fi elsewhere? What if we could avoid losing skills by simply uploading data to our brains, like in the Matrix? Or what if we just finally said, okay, that's too much work, that's too high risk. What if we just sent avatars of ourselves to another planet? Okay, so all of this is to say that the future is closer than we think. So I gave you an example of employing VR in an underwater environment previously, and we've actually built out different modules for the Canadian Space Agency for astronauts to use for healthcare and skills maintenance during long duration space flight. So another example of what we've built is modules that allow you to practice IVs and intubation and central lines in virtual reality. So the next time you have to pull an IV in a patient, you're not suddenly forgetting what you learned on Earth 9 months prior. Here's snapshots of the radiology reading room I was alluding to earlier. So now imagine that you're in your VR headset, and we're actually going to bring in these headsets for you on March 15th if COVID lets us, and you'll get to experience this for yourself. So now imagine that you have a trauma patient and you're not quite sure what you're seeing, and you request a consult from Earth, and you're able to meet with a radiologist and say, hey, how bad is this fracture really? Does it need to be set, or can I just cast it and leave it? And like I said, we've also developed we're going to skip past the video in the interest of time. We've also developed sepsis modules for lunar and space environments. So here's a snapshot from that. And we've also tested, in addition to underwater, we've also managed to test this.
Here is Heidi on video. Look at me and wave.
So
amazing.
This is my colleague Heidi wearing that same headset in 0G. All right, so what else can we learn and draw inspiration from in the world of science fiction? So here's an awesome article. It's from the MIT Technology Review. It's called Engineering the Perfect Astronaut. And in it, they talk about splicing in elephant genes into astronauts, and not to generate some sort of hybrid elephant human astronaut, but because the authors make the environment that if you are sending astronauts to this dangerous, high radiation environment, you should be making the argument that it's unethical to genetically augment astronauts. You should be making the argument that it's unethical to not augment them because you're not making them as prepared as possible. And so why elephants? Elephants don't get cancer. And the reason is they have multiple copies of their cancer editing oncogenes. And so their proposal is to splice more of these cancer editing genes into humans to make them more resistant to getting cancer in these high radiation environments. The future is closer than we think. So here's a snapshot from a study that came back from the International Space Station in September 2020. Basically, they took these genetically engineered jacked up little mice. That's this muscular, cute little mouse you see here on the left compared to a non-genetically engineered counterpart. They took flown groups and non-flown groups, and finally they introduced a muscular blockade called the ACVR2 neuromuscular blockade that prevents further muscle and bone breakdown. And what they found in these genetically jacked up little mice is that the ones with the neuromuscular blockade not only had less bone density loss. In some cases, they had increased muscle mass. They were more resistant to this hostile environment. So NASA is literally engineering mighty mass. The practicality of this is that we have all of these gene synthesis technologies at our fingertips. We talked a lot about emerging technologies, but things like CRISPR that allow us to augment humans and animals for different austere environments have a lot of potential for spaceflight. In addition, you see the slide allude to point of care analysis that allow us to diagnose in real time. So we don't have, so that we're able to perform blood work on station. And so this is what we talk about when we return to that theme from last time about precision point of care diagnostics. Machine learning and AI is another emerging technology that can help prepare us for the spaceflight environment. So think of something like TARS or HAL 9000, but instead of trying to kill you, helps you with your decision-making diagnosis and just-in-time management. So physicians, even the smartest physicians, only know so much. Part of our job in this day and age is not just to know key elements of management, but also where to find that key and look up emerging data and new guidelines. And the thinking is that machine learning can help us improve that diagnostics, or thinking back to last time, maybe we can just bring pigeons along with us to space. We talked about the value of 3D printing last time for medicine as a whole. So Made in Space, we talked about, is a 3D printer that first went to the station about 10, 11 years ago. So what about taking a step further and bringing 3D bioprinters to Mars? And so now if we need to print a new tissue graft, a skin graft, 3D print an organ, in theory, the building blocks are in place for us to be able to do that. Because these crews are going to be so remote that they need to function autonomously. Okay, elsewhere in the world of science fiction coming to reality, this is a snapshot of the Orbital Assembly vision for the world's first rotating partial gravity commercial space station. So a space hotel with artificial gravity. So I talked to you about wearing multiple hats. You heard about my work with Luxonic. So this is another snapshot of some of my other space work. So how do we mitigate the deleterious effects of the artificial gravity environment, or the zero gravity environment, by bringing gravity with us? So this is simple physics. You generate gravity. The level of gravity that you generate is a factor of the, or is a product of the rate of rotation of your station, as well as the radius of your spinning structure. So now if you can provide a certain level of gravity en route to Mars, maybe you can avoid some of that decompensation and bone fluid shift and bone density loss. Elsewhere, looking at sci-fi and advanced concepts, what about human hibernation? Well, the European Space Agency performed a study in 2019 and calculated if you could somehow induce artificial hibernation in humans, and you just woke them up 3 weeks before touching the surface of Mars after a 6 to 9 month hibernation, you could actually save on the amount of resources that you use en route to Mars, and actually even diminish the size of your spaceship by 33%. And so there's real world institutes actually studying this. The Alaska Institute of Biology is looking at inducing hibernation into non-hibernating species. Why? So we kind of talked about that. The ground squirrel can hibernate over the winter and can decrease its metabolic use by 99%. Okay, so think of the resources that you could save on if you hibernate. So the next thing they tried to do was induce hibernation in your everyday rat. And they did manage to do it. They managed to decrease their metabolic use and rate by 99%. They just have a few kinks to work out, like increased risk of gut ischemia, perforation, sepsis, and death. So a few hurdles left there. Okay, so what if we said, well, that's all a lot of work. Why don't we just create a faster vehicle? So there's people working on that as well. This is a concept for the Basmeer plasma engine. This is pioneered by former NASA astronaut Frank Chang Diaz, and what he proposes to do is use Basmeer plasma engine technologies to get to Mars in as little as 39 days. All right, so I hope it's becoming clear that in order to successfully send humans to the moon and beyond, we are going to have to science the space out of this with a little bit of MacGyvering and resourcefulness as well. So in the last 15 minutes here, let's talk about the frontier of space medicine. We talked about engineering artificial gravity, but the question that follows from that is how much gravity is enough gravity? We still don't have the data on everything that comes in between. We know what microgravity does, and we're still finding out. We know what 1G does, but how much gravity is enough for what duration, what period of time? Because if 1/6 gravity is enough, that's amazing news for Mars. We can expect humans to save on a lot of physiological deleterious effects when they arrive there. If it's not, we still have some things to figure out. What about the psychology of selecting a crew for Mars? So we know that the crews selected for these austere environments have to be able to deal with adversity, austerity, boredom, highly operational schedules. They have to be used to dealing with being away from the creature comforts of everyday life, so away from their friends, their family, their dogs, and even their Starbucks. And there's even actually research around what contributes to psychological resilience in austere environments. And so this is actually snippets from a book chapter on the subject that I wrote in austere environments. And what we learn is that it's not an innate trait. It's not that you're born more resilient or not, but it's an adaptive trait. So you can actually learn to be more resilient. And depending on which model you look at, there's actually key traits that contribute that you can apply to build up that resilience. And so that involves breaking things down. So looking at monumental tasks and focusing on the first step, positive self-talk, telling yourself that you got this, mental rehearsal. So practicing for the best and worst case scenarios, impulse control, resisting that urge to give up or give in to negativity, and also relying on your social support. So if you're in the pandemic, this may be people that you're connected to at home or via internet or social media. If you're in space, this is your crew, and your crew really becomes your family. There's also research around coping against austere environments and adversity. And here's the link, the citation to the book chapter. So planful problem solving. So it's almost as analogous to the breaking things down that we saw with resilience traits, seeking social supports, relying on your social support network, enduring harsh conditions. There's that resisting the urge or engaging in impulse control, resisting the urge to give up, emphasizing the positive. That's that positive self-talk. And then this one's a little bit different, relying on luck. So realizing that certain things are out of your hands. So we've engaged in a few thought experiments over the past few classes. So here's one that I also like to engage in, and it's, why do we have to accept austerity? What if we made an austere environment a little bit less austere? So how do we do that, knowing all of our constraints? So one thing I've started spending some thought and time on is, what if we just bring a form of morale with us to a long duration mission? What if we spent the crew resources to bring a pet with us to Mars? What are the trade-offs of that? Of course, you're going to use more mass, more of your life support system, more resources, but is it worth it? Is there enough of a trade-off if you are able to support crew morale? So there's lots of ways that we can think about the psychology of spaceflight. And just to take a little break here, in case you've ever wondered what different pets do in the 0G, wonder no more. Here is a little snapshot of pigeons in space.
Pigeons normally keep their bodies in a horizontal axis while in flight. These 0G birds have lost their feeling for what is up or down and point in all directions, some even flying upside down.
So the amazing part about this
Pigeons
adaptation,
normally keep their
it's kind
bodies
of fun to look at birds in 0G, but what's really cool is you can actually look at how quickly they adapt, and they're avoiding, even in 0G, managing to hit the walls and the ceiling. So a little bit of cool physiology there. Okay, so continuing on the sphere of self-sufficiency, psychology, resilience. Well, how self-sufficient do crews on Mars need to be, and how resilient do they need to be? And I would posit that maybe this is a step too far. This is a snapshot of Leonid Rogozov from, he was a Soviet physician and an Antarctic deployment in 1961. He felt some right lower quadrant pain, tried to walk it off. It was getting worse. He tried to treat himself with antibiotics. It was getting worse. And finally, he resigned himself to, well, I guess I'm gonna have to take out my own appendix because otherwise I'll die. And so this is a picture of him actually performing his own appendectomy. He survived and lived to tell the tale. But what does that mean for Mars and beyond? Here is a paper actually on the subject by some well-known names in the field, some flight surgeons at NASA and the CSA. And basically they explore, is it worth having a prophylactic appendectomy before you send humans to Mars so you can avoid that exact scenario? You've seen what Dr. Rogozov perform his own appendectomy in 1G. Now imagine having to do that in the gravity of Mars. And there's precedent for this. So this is King George Island, a Chilean settlement just off the coast of Antarctica. And the rule to live there is that anyone above the age of 6 has to have an appendectomy before they're cleared to live there because they're just so remote from definitive medical care. So it's not out of the realm of possibility to introduce this idea for Mars. We talked about the challenges of radiation. And so when we talk about establishing permanent settlements on the moon and Mars, we also have to look at what this means for habitats, because you see all of these artist depictions of different types of habitats. But there's some suggestion that, that's not going to be enough because of all of the massive material you'll have to bring with you. In fact, you're best off creating an underground habitat protected by meters of regolith to filter all of that radiation out. We talked a little bit about the packing challenges of space, and what that means for food. So anything we bring with us has to be portable, have a long shelf life, be textured, be flavorful, be nutritionally sound. So this is another company I'm working with. This is Astrius that I'm a medical advisor. I'm creating portable, long duration, nutritious foods for performers in austere environments to be able to meet those needs despite being isolated and confined. Other questions that we need to challenge to answer going forward is how our medical capabilities for EVA need to change. So we've established that if we're going to the moon, we're going to be performing surface EVAs. That means we're in this rocky, dusty terrain. We're more prone to trauma and falls. That means maybe we need to also change what we're prepared for, the probability of it occurring, and what goes into our medical kit. And if we're serious about establishing a permanent off-world presence on the moon, well, then that implies the establishment of permanent medical capabilities. So how do we, what inspiration do we draw from previous austere environments? What lessons do we learn from military medical deployments in Afghanistan, from refugee camps, from the International Space Station? And in what order do we go about building them up, training personnel, and creating bringing in the supporting technology? And so this is kind of my vision of how that would occur. So starting with the basics of in situ medical treatment, first aid medical kit like we have on ISS, realizing that as evacuation gets further and further away, so remembering that it's 3 to 5 days back to Earth if you have something bad happens on the moon, like you break a hip. So then being able to stabilize for a prolonged period of time before evacuating, to not having the option of evacuating by the time you're on Mars, so needing to essentially be able to perform surgery on Mars, as well as having advanced surgical capabilities and an ICU, and then also building up the things that will help prevent getting in those situations in the first place, like your preventative and primary care strategies. So eventually at some point being able to perform pap smears and colonoscopies on Mars, while keeping in mind your packing restraints and knowing that you're going to be more resource and power, volume, mass constrained. So maybe you can't bring monitors with you. Maybe your wall has to be your monitor on which you read your patient's vital signs. And this isn't just my thoughts on the subject. So there's entire fields of study around very specific things in spaceflight. Here's a seminal paper on guidelines for CPR in spaceflight, published by the European Society for Aerospace Medicine. So as we get to the end of this lecture, I hope it's becoming apparent that there's no shortage of questions to answer. Living in a pandemic, we can't help but ask, well, what happens when COVID gets to the moon? How are we going to handle the first moondemic? What is isolation going to look like? Do we have to socially distance to 36 feet in 1/6 gravity? If we're serious about establishing a permanent off-world human presence, that implies procreation. So if we're going to talk about space birds and the space bees, how does copulation, fertilization, development, and parturition, birth happen in altered gravity environments? Question mark followed by 5 more question marks. And so I've done some work on the subject, and the bottom line is we still don't know, despite having some studies from insect species, fish, mammalian studies, rats. The data at best is conflicting, and we still need to know what the critical gravity-dependent development periods, mechanisms of mutations, mechanisms of implantation, development, and birth, and what level of gravity for what exposure period we need to mitigate those are. And so here's the citation to the book chapter I've written on the subject. But to summarize, the problem with pregnancy, even in 1G, is it's an incredibly complex process. Things can go wrong, even in a controlled 1G environment. You may have to emergently perform a C-section, do a forceps delivery for an aberrant heart rate. You may have to transfuse someone. So there's all of these forward-looking questions that we have to start asking now if we're serious about establishing a permanent off-world presence, as well as the ethical considerations that come with that. And then, of course, I'm sure there's the question you're all wondering about, is that if you give birth in space, is your baby an illegal alien? So moving on in the last 2 minutes here, we talked about maintaining the standards when it comes to healthcare in space. And right now we have a World Health Organization to create standards across the globe. But if we're expanding that to space, how do we maintain these regulations and standards of best practices for a galactic health organization? And how do we govern that? And then how do we train the next generation of physicians to look after these astronaut populations? Are we going to have to start creating specialties for doctors with a specialty in moon medicine or Mars medicine? And what does that curriculum and training look like? And finally, because as we've seen over the course of this course, is that humans are a very ingenious and resourceful species. Once we reach Mars, once we've conquered all those hurdles, where do we go to next? So let's bring it back to Earth in the last few minutes here. We briefly alluded to what an exciting time this is to be alive in general in 2022, but we talked a little bit last time about the leaps and bounds we've made in the commercial space sector. Last year alone, we saw the successful commercial space flights with suborbital flights with Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and even an orbital mission with Inspiration 4 and SpaceX. And so when we talk about guidelines and creating a space safer environment for all, it's not just Mars, it's not just NASA astronauts, it's also anyone who wants to be able to access space, because that time is here. So here's a citation to a paper that I've written on medical guidelines with my co-authors for commercial suborbital spaceflight. And the bottom line is the data is actually pretty promising, because these suborbital space flights are on the order of minutes. You're actually, weightless for 3 minutes, and then you're coming back to Earth. And what we found from those centrifuge studies that you saw earlier is that people actually handle increased G loads really well. And from test subjects from as young as 18 to as old as 89 with all sorts of chronic conditions, people did really well. And as we mentioned last class, the most common reason that someone would be disqualified would be because of anxiety, claustrophobia, or doing something unsafe. So finally, let's take it one step further. If we're truly serious about democratizing access to space in this day and age, how do we make space truly accessible? Stephen Hawking took a first step in 2009. He flew 0G in parabolic flight with the 0G Corporation. And then for a long time, nothing happened until last year in a history-making moment, the European Space Agency announced its first ever call for para-astronauts. So looking for astronauts with lower limb deficiencies and disabilities, or a short stature, to be part of their astronaut corps. And then in October of last year, Astro Access flew 12 disabled Astro Access ambassadors in parabolic flight, including deaf astronauts, deaf ambassadors, quadriplegic astronaut ambassadors, and more. Finally, we talked about a lot of technologies with a lot of potential for keeping humans safe when they're remote and resource limited. Let's come back to the question that we asked earlier. How does the ISS compare to, say, a remote village in Kenya? Well, they're both remote and resource limited. And as we've seen, that these are an excellent breeding ground for innovation. which is particularly relevant because 44% of the world's population as of 2019 was rural. So how do we bring these benefits back to Earth? Well, it's already being done, and there's a lot more work to be, a lot more benefit to be brought back to Earth. So we've seen in the top left corner, iodine resin filters from the International Space Station used to keep water clean up there, being used to provide clean water to remote villages in Kenya. We've used handheld ultrasound to provide prenatal and maternal care to Arctic populations in the north. We see solar-powered refrigerators able to provide refrigerated vaccines to areas without electricity. We've seen atmospheric scrubbers used to keep clean atmospheres to increase the length and shelf life of produce in the supply chain. So we talked about a lot this hour. My hope is that you've walked away now with a sense of the hazards of the spaceflight environment, the tools for mitigating the risks of the spaceflight environment, the challenges of packing for space. That comes up on exams a lot, hint, hint, so make sure you know those. How we prepare through analog environments, how we can enlist emerging technologies to prepare us for these challenging environments, and how we bring these challenges back to Earth. So the bottom line is we have a lot of challenges. There's no shortage of them. We're just beginning to solve them, and we need all comers. So if we're interested, we need you, and it starts with solving for a single step. Thank you so much. Invite your questions, and you'll have access to these slides afterwards. And here are resources if you're interested in space medicine and austere environment medicine. So we'll turn it over to questions. I've also included tutorials on specific aspects of space medicine in case you're interested. All right, over to you.
Okay, any questions? I'm sure there will be some. Let's go to gallery view here. Yeah.
So Dr. Pandya, you do like a lot of research and have published a lot of stuff in relation to space exploration. How would you get more involved in that kind of stuff as a student or someone with kind of limited experience in that area?
That's a great question. Thanks for that. So the question was about how getting involved as a student. I think the first thing is to start attending conferences. Your students are always welcomed. And so you'll see in the resources that I've provided at the end, I also include really good space conferences to attend. So let's just go to the very end here. The International Astronautical Congress is a really good congress. The Aerospace Conference, the Aerospace Medical Association Conference is a really good space medicine conference. And that's how I got my start. In fact, when we talked about space medical spin-off technologies that benefit Earth, I simply started attending the IAC conferences. I presented my first paper on telemedicine, and then someone saw that paper and said, "Hey, do you want to write a book chapter on that?" And as a second-year medical student, I was lucky enough to write a book chapter. So it starts with just looking out for these resources, participating, looking for opportunities, and hopefully you'll find some of these links useful. Any other questions? Stop sharing. Well, as always, you can send me an email if you have any questions, and you get me for another lecture on Thursday where that's you guys actually doing all the work there. We'll be putting all of these concepts that we've learned into practice. You'll be working in small groups in breakout rooms. And then on the 15th, hopefully, of March, I'll see you in person.
Okay. Another great session. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you on Thursday.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.